Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they mocked as they slapped him across the face. Pilate went outside again and said to the people, "I am going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Look, here is the man." When they saw him, the leading priests and the temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "Take him yourselves and crucify him," Pilate said. "I find him not guilty." The Jewish leaders replied, "By our law he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into the headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "Why don't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus said, "You would have no power over me at all, unless it were given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin."
Every week in VFW halls and church basements and private living rooms, recovering addicts get together to share with one another, to help each other on their road to recovery. If you're familiar with these communities, you know that one of the reasons that we struggle with addiction is because we try to control things that we do not have the capacity to control, and we're never given the power to control. And so a prayer that is often attributed to a Lutheran theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr, popularly called the Serenity prayer, has become something of an anthem for addict communities. If you don't know the prayer, it starts with, "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to have the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." Now, an expanded version of that prayer goes on to say, "That I may be reasonably happy in this life. That I may be reasonably happy in this life, but supremely happy with you forever in the next." You have grown up in a world that hands you the narrative that you ought to be supremely happy, that it is your right to be supremely happy, that you deserve to be supremely happy, and that the path to supreme happiness is the path of power, specifically the power to control. This is the last week of a series that I've been doing that I'm calling What If Jesus Came? This is not the last Sunday of the season of Lent. That is next Sunday, Palm Sunday. We're going to shift gears and do something different with Palm Sunday as we approach Holy Week. So I'm ending the series today. If you haven't been here, this is the question that the series is asking. What if Jesus showed up today? What if he showed up? I'm not talking baby Jesus. I'm talking walking, talking, adult, healing, preaching Jesus. What if he started hanging out with your friend group or working at your job, or if he started a popular podcast? How would we respond to him? What would we do? And the thesis of the series has been pretty simple. I think we would reject Jesus today just like people did 2,000 years ago, and for basically the same reason. That just like them, you and I are born into a world that hands us stories that we implicitly receive, we internalize, and we allow them to shape the way we live, how we understand everything, what we value, even down to where we kind of put our bodies in space and time. Because those narratives are so deeply held, we lack the ability to critique them for what they are. We think we're holding on to truth when really we've believed something that's false. So when the truth actually shows up as it did 2,000 years ago, we often reject truth, ironically, in the name of truth. We reject goodness in the name of goodness. We reject rightness in the name of righteousness. That's what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago, and I think it would happen today. Because just like them, we are just as deeply shaped by narratives we've talked about the narrative of accumulation. We've talked about the narrative of consumption. Today, I want to end the series by talking about the narrative of power, specifically the power to control. And that's what I mean by power, just to clarify my term. I'm talking about power personally, And what I mean when I say power is essentially the ability to determine an outcome. So power in that sense is essentially equal to control to the degree that you get to decide what happens next. You have power. And if we're being honest, it is the kind of power we want that we wish we had more of. It is the kind of power that Pilate has. In the scene that you just heard a moment ago, Jesus has been arrested by religious authorities. They take him to the Roman governor at the time, a man named Pontius Pilate. Pilate puts him on trial for all intents and purposes, interrogates him, decides that Jesus is innocent, doesn't deserve to be crucified, but the religious leaders keep pressing. So he asks Jesus questions, Jesus won't respond, and you get the sense he's a little exasperated. Pilate says, "Why won't you talk to me? Why won't you answer me? Don't you understand that I have the power?" Greek word is exousia, it means authority. Don't you understand that I have the authority? I get to determine what happens next, either letting you go or putting you to death. In that specific arena, Pilate had that kind of power to determine an outcome. Now, you all have that kind of power. We all do in some departments of our lives. If you own a company, you have the power to determine who you hire, who you fire, what you pay them. You may not have the power to determine if you get a job, but if you have a job, you have the power to determine if you stay there. You have the power to decide if you go out to party or stay home to study. I mean, we all have some degree of that kind of agency in our lives. If we're being honest, not nearly enough. If it were up to us, we would prefer to have far more power to determine outcomes. And not just for us, but for everybody else. We want to determine what our children do and how their lives turn out. We want to determine what happens in our marriages. We want to determine who we work for and how much we make. We want to determine when we retire and what we get to do afterward. We want to determine how our parents parent us. We want to determine who plays in the game and how many minutes. We want to determine who's in political office and what they do or don't do. We want to determine what happens with our bodies. We want to determine how we die and what happens with our remains. If tomorrow someone could grant you the ultimate authority to determine every single dimension of your life, you would take it in a heartbeat. One of the most frustrating experiences for you, for me, is having to deal with situations where we do not have as much power to control an outcome as we wish we had. Because I have been raised and shaped in a world that has told me, Mike, you deserve to be supremely happy, and the best way to be supremely happy is for you to determine as many outcomes as is conceivably possible. So I want as much power to control as I can get my hands on. You are probably similar. And in that way, we're very similar to a man named Caiaphas. So in his trial with Pilate, Pilate says to Jesus, right, don't you know that I have the authority, the power to crucify you or let you go? Jesus says two things in response. He says, you would have no power unless it were given to you from above. And then he says, and therefore, the person who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. It's a very strange and cryptic statement that I think we should spend some time unpacking. First, we should note that there is such a thing as greater sin. This isn't central to my point this morning, but if you're anything like me, I was raised in a religious environment where like all sin is sin and it's all equally bad. Like a 9-year-old who lifts a candy bar off a grocery store shelf is just as evil as Hitler. It's all on one level. And you can make very complex, very convoluted theological arguments for why that is true, or you can just get up every day as someone who's not theologically trained at all and just observe the world and know that it's not. You know that someone who commits mass murder is committing a greater sin than a 10-year-old who steals a Pez dispenser. And our whole law is based on that fact. We don't sentence 10-year-olds to death for stealing Pez dispensers because we understand that it's not as big a deal. So while not central to my point this morning, I think hopefully it's a little informative. Jesus seemed to think there was greater sin. His brother James thought the same thing. Second, we should probably clarify who Jesus is talking about when he says, the person who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. If you've heard this text before, your brain may immediately jump to a man named Judas. Judas was one of Jesus' disciples. Judas famously betrayed Jesus. That's how Jesus ended up arrested in the first place. So when we hear Jesus say, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin, many of us immediately, we think about Judas. I don't think that's who Jesus is talking about. First of all, Judas did not hand Jesus over to Pilate. Judas handed Jesus over to the religious leaders. And the way the narrative is told in the Gospels, he was remorseful about that, which would suggest that he either did not know what those religious leaders were going to do with Jesus, or he did not want them to do what they did. When he finds out they turned him over to the Roman authorities and that he was going to be executed, he was so overcome with shame and guilt, he took his own life. That's one giant piece of evidence to suggest Jesus is not talking about Jesus. I think the more convincing evidence is actually the language that John uses in his telling of the story. John is a master at this. You just have to pay attention to it. So in John chapter 18, Caiaphas is the one who makes the decision to hand Jesus over to Pilate, and then actually uses that language when talking to Pilate. When they arrive at Pilate and they hand Jesus over to Pilate, Pilate can tell something fishy is going on. He knows that they've got mixed motives. So Pilate interrogates them first. And Caiaphas is the one who says, if he were not guilty, we would not have handed him over to you. The fact that Caiaphas uses the language of handed him over to you, and Jesus uses the language of the one who handed me over to you. That is John's way as a writer of connecting the scenes for you. When Jesus says that the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin, he's talking about Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, the head of the religious establishment. Now, why is Caiaphas' sin greater? I mean, both Caiaphas and Pilate are going to participate in Jesus' execution. Why does Jesus say Caiaphas is guilty of the greater sin? I think it has something to do with power. The kind of power that each person is grasping for or exercising. One way to think about the government, the state, the sword, right? Pilate is a Roman governor, a political official, a state official. One way to think about the state is that its job is to control things externally so that we can all basically get along and live our lives. All right, you and I are going to get up every day, and you do not have to be a religious person. You do not need religious language for this. You and I get up every day, and we are all totally and completely confident someone, somewhere, is going to do something so self-interested, it's going to hurt somebody else. Are you all pretty confident that's going to happen today? Somewhere in the world, times 8 billion. Maybe you'll be the person to do it. Maybe somebody will do it to you. Somebody is going to get up today, and they are going to do something that is so self-interested, so selfish, it is going to harm another human being. Times 8 billion. I don't want to live in a world like that. But there are only two ways to deal with that problem. People grow up, they transform, they change internally. They become the kinds of people who, when they get up in the morning, they just think, I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to do right by everybody. Even if it means I suffer, even if it means I sacrifice a little bit, I'm going to go out into the world and I am going to actually care about other people, even people I don't know. Now, if you could do that times 8 billion, you would not need any laws. That's essentially the argument the Apostle Paul makes. If you got up every day and you and I were genuinely driven internally, comprehensively by what he calls the law of love, then you would need no laws out there or threat of punishment. That is the job of the church. That's what the church is here to do. The church is here to help people grow up, to become the kinds of people we're supposed to be, so that we actually walk out into the world and live the kinds of lives God created us to live. And we do that internally through influence. It is a long, painful, difficult, sometimes frustrating process. And we can't guarantee that everybody's going to opt into that process. So if you can't get 8 billion people to grow up internally, what are you left with? Well, you have to govern them externally. Essentially, you have to say to people, look, I know you're going to get up and be tempted to do something wrong that's going to hurt somebody else, so I'm telling you right now, you're not allowed to do it, and if you do it, we're going to punish you for it. And the hope is that that deters people from doing those things. They're in fact so selfish, so self-interested, that their own well-being, the thought of getting caught or getting punished, actually motivates them to do the right thing. That's Pilate's job. Pilate's job is to create a world where everybody can basically get up, keep a relative peace, go about their life, do their thing, and the wheels kind of turn, and everything's sort of working. Now, let me be very clear. He's not doing it in a way that honors the God who gave him the authority. He is going to participate in the execution of an innocent person. It's important to note that Jesus says Caiaphas is guilty of the greater sin. That does not mean Pilate is guilty of no sin. Pilate is going to do something that Pilate should not do. But at least he's exercising the power that he has been given, and he's doing it in a way that demonstrates at least some moral sensitivity to what's in front of him, which is a remarkable aspect of this story. If you've never really thought about this, if you compare Pilate, a Roman governor, and the Romans were reflexively violent. They could kill you at the drop of a hat and then go have a sandwich. Caiaphas is a religious leader. He's in charge of a spiritual community of people. At the center of that community is supposed to be God. And yet it's Pilate who demonstrates even a modicum of moral sensitivity here. He interrogates Jesus. He acknowledges that Jesus is innocent, does not deserve to die, and actually tries to let him go. Caiaphas is the one, as the religious leader, who keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. At the end of the day, while there was probably some self-interest in this, Pilate executes Jesus because he's got a choice on his hands. I can execute one innocent person. That's probably not a good idea. I don't feel comfortable doing that. But as I'm looking out at this sea of people, if I don't do that, there's a possibility I might have to kill hundreds of innocent people. They're going to riot. They don't even know why they're here. They've just been whipped up into a frenzy by the religious leaders who I sense have mixed motives. So I'm either going to execute one innocent person or I might have to execute many. And so he chooses the more expedient route. It isn't right. It's sin. It's not the thing that would honor God. It's not a God-honoring exercise of the power and authority he'd been given. But at least it was his power given to execute. And that's probably what Jesus is getting at when he says you'd have no power if it had not been given to you. That's probably Jesus' way of saying, hey, just remember where that power came from and use it appropriately, which Pilate does not do. But at least he's in his lane. It's a different story with Caiaphas. The only reason Caiaphas brings Jesus to Pilate in the first place is not because he wants to have Jesus executed and Pilate is the one who's allowed to do that. That is true. why does he want to have Jesus executed in the first place? He's not just trying to control the outcome of whether Jesus lives or dies. He's trying to control the outcome of whether Jesus lives or dies because he's trying to control the outcome of how this whole spiritual community operates. And the reason he's guilty of a greater sin is because he should have known better. As a religious leader, as a priest, as someone who knows God, he ought to know what real power is and how to exercise it. Real power, God's power, is not the ability to control. We often think it is. This is my own little pet opinion on this, but having talked to lots and lots of people over my career as a pastor, I think lots of Christians would prefer to worship a God of bald, naked power than a God of love. Everybody wants to be on the side of the guy who can push the button and do whatever he wants. And I think there are a lot of Christian people who are in love with the idea that God is someone who can do whatever he wants. Without knowing it, they are essentially worshiping a God of naked power. That is not the God that we have in the Christian faith. It is not the God who shows up in the pages of creation. It is not the God who patiently works with the people of Israel. Certainly not the God who shows up in the person of Jesus Christ. That God is not a God who exercises power to control. That God is a God who exercises power to create. Real power is not the ability to control. It is the power to create. That's what God does. God exercises God's power to bring something out of nothing, to create life where there wasn't any. The God who works with the people of Israel isn't controlling them or coercing them or determining their outcomes. He's coming alongside of them, suffering them, teaching them, admonishing them. Jesus Christ certainly doesn't hit the streets of Palestine controlling things. Actually, I imagine that was one of the most frustrating things for his disciples. Imagine how enervating it would be if you're walking around with a guy who can raise people from the dead, and you got all these problems, and Jesus won't do anything about them. I feel like that would be very frustrating. Jesus, why don't you fix that? Why don't you fix this? Why don't you change that? Jesus didn't operate that way because he wasn't manifesting power as the ability to control things. He was manifesting power to create. That is the power you have been given. As made in the image of God. Yes, are there some arenas in your life where you've been given authority to control outcomes? Absolutely, we all have some of that. But that's not the power that's in God, that is in you by nature of you being created in the image of God. The power you've been given is the power to create. It's the power to give life. And you know how you do that? You do it the same way God did it. You exercise the power to create by making it possible for other people to make things possible. That's what God does. God creates human beings and gives them the power to make stuff. The power we have made in the image of God is to create. It's to give life. It's to come alongside people and help them to flourish, to make something of their lives. That's real power, not to determine outcomes for them. Caiaphas should have known that. He knew that God. He should have understood that. But as a religious leader, and all religious leaders are tempted to do this, I am no different. I am susceptible to this. All religious leaders are tempted. Instead of coming alongside of people and acknowledging, look, you are on a spiritual journey. And as a religious leader, I cannot control what you believe. I can't control how you live. I can't control what you do and don't do. That's not my job. Our job is to come alongside of you to help you make something of your life, to help you to know God, maybe to help you love God. And maybe as you come to know God and love God, maybe you'll decide in your own life to start following God. And maybe if you choose to do that, you'll start to experience things like healing and wholeness, peace, wisdom. You'll start to unlock all new ways of being human in the world. That's what religious leaders and religious establishments are supposed to do. And maybe if Caiaphas had actually done that, Jesus wouldn't have been such a threat. But that's not what he did. Instead, what he's trying to do is control everyone externally, much like what Pilate's job is to do. He's trying to look at all of his people and saying, look, here's how it goes. You are going to believe these things. You are going to do these things. You are not going to do these things. And that's how it works. Everybody get on board. And I'll be paying attention. So if you don't get on board, if you break the rules, if you happen to not agree with me, I will find out about it. And there will be consequences for that. You could be thrown out of the synagogue. You could be restricted from temple. Heck, you could be stoned to death. So when someone like Jesus rolls into town and starts telling your people things that you don't understand or agree with, starts influencing them to behave in ways that you don't understand or accept, you start losing control. And that's what you're really after. And when you start losing the control to determine outcomes, you have to get rid of the people who are taking it away from you. Control, the power to control always participates in some kind of execution, some kind of crucifixion. It's just how it works. Think about this. The power to create is a positive sum arrangement. It just multiplies the more you give it away. If I can play an instrument skillfully, which I cannot, but if I could, I don't lose that power by sharing it with you. You just gain it. And in fact, my skill might actually go up by sharing it with you. If over the course of my life, I have learned some things that have helped me become a better human being, a more faithful follower of Jesus, if I've overcome some sin, if I've wrestled with some big questions, I don't lose any of that competence by helping you gain that competence. In fact, mine probably just grows as yours grows. That's the beauty of power as the ability to create. It just multiplies flourishing the more you give it away. The power to control is a zero-sum game. It works the exact opposite. The power to control, the more you share it, the less you have. If I'm sitting on a board of trustees and there are two of us, I got a 50% stake in determining what happens next. If you add a person to that board, I now have a 33% stake, and so forth, and so on, and so on. If I'm interested in controlling outcomes, I cannot share power with anyone. I can't get other people involved. In fact, I have to protect myself and whatever my agenda is from everyone, especially people who disagree with me or don't live the way I think they should, because that poses a threat to everyone, to the conformity of the group. That's what Caiaphas is doing. He is trying to control Israel's way of life and their way of worship externally, from the outside. That is not power he was given. And he should have known that. Jesus was on record as saying, look, a servant who knows his master's business and is unwilling or unable to follow through will be punished more severely. The servant who doesn't know but does what is wrong will be punished lightly. Because the person who has been given more will be expected. To the person who has greater responsibility, more is required. That is Caiaphas and Pilate. Pilate is doing something Pilate should not do, but he does not know any better. It is wrong. He'll be punished lightly for it. Caiaphas is a man of God. He's in charge of a religious community. But he's so concerned about controlling things that somewhere along the lines, he lost the kind of moral sensitivity that you see in someone like Pilate. A religious person finds himself in a place where he's willing to say, you know what, in order to hold this thing together the way that we've got it here, we're going to need to kill that guy over there. And doesn't seem to appreciate how contrary to the creative God who is giver of life that is. Now, what we have to reckon with and deal with in the season of Lent is that you have been given the power to create every day of your life. You have been given opportunities to come alongside other people and help them. Not control them, not coerce them, not determine outcomes for them or for you, but to help them. But over and over and over and over again, instead of receiving and exercising the power you have been given, which is the power to help, you and I seize the power to control, to coerce, and not just ourselves, but everybody else. This is becoming truer and truer for me and parents that are younger than me. We don't want to influence our kids, we want to control them. We specifically want to control the decisions they make and the outcomes that result from those decisions, because we're terrified that they will make bad choices. So instead of influencing them internally, we try to control them and box them in externally. It is exhausting, both for you and for the people you're trying to control. If you are a married person, this is true of marriage. It's so hard, isn't it, being married to someone who's not you? It is. But over and over and over and over again, instead of accepting the partner you have, being grateful to God that you have one, appreciating all that that person brings to the table, and being able to honestly lament the fact that they're not everything you dreamed of. And simply to embrace them and to patiently live together and to help each other become the people that God wants us to be. Instead, more often than not, we're trying to control them. We're trying to get them to be somebody they can't be, at least not yet. We're trying to force outcomes faster than those outcomes can come. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting for you and it's exhausting for the other person. We try to do this politically. Instead of influencing a world, we want to control it. We want to coercively turn it into what we think it ought to be. Guys, churches do this. Churches do this to people. And it slides under the radar because we're all so nice and we're out like doing good things in the world that half the time we don't realize we're sitting in a toxic spiritual environment. I'm telling you right now, if you are in this place right now and you feel like you have to believe A, B, and C, that you are not allowed to ask questions, that you are not allowed to doubt, that you are not allowed to struggle with a belief, that you are not allowed to be honest, then this place has become toxic and you should leave. I don't care how nice the people are. I don't care how many things you're doing in the world. If you are in an environment where you cannot be honest about who you are and where you are, that world is toxic. It's killing your soul. And the reason is because somebody's trying to control it. Instead of coming alongside of you and accepting where you are and just saying, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help you know God? In the hopes that maybe you'll love God, and then in the hopes that maybe you'll decide for yourself that you want to follow God. Instead of adopting that posture, it becomes you have to believe these things, you have to live this way, because let's be honest, that's how you run a church. It's really difficult to run a church if you invite people to ask a bunch of questions. It's much easier to say, look, this is the game, this is what we believe, this is what we do, get on board or find another place. And then you find people in church classrooms all the time who feel like, man, I could never say what's actually on my mind right now because the people who I've been friends with for decades would disown me. That's an incredibly unhealthy place to be. That's the world Caiaphas created. And he handed Jesus over to Pilate in order to protect it. Now, the thing that you have to reckon with in your life in the season of Lent. Again, we don't live in Lent. Christian people, we're not Lent people. We're Easter people, but you got to visit it. You got to visit it every once in a while. The thing that you have to deal with over Easter, over Lent, is just how much of your life is characterized by the need to control. You have to be honest. Every day you get up, your kids, your marriage, your jobs, your 401ks, your retirement plan, your physical health, the neighbor down the street, how much of your time and energy is being spent worrying and trying to control things you have absolutely no control over, never will, and you're not supposed to. To the degree that you're getting up every day and trying to control everything, without being too dramatic, I'm trying to tell you that is a participation in crucifixion. Someone's getting hurt. The power that you've been given is the power to create. Faith's antidote is the Serenity prayer. It is the courage to accept that you can change some things. You can change the narrative you've spun up in your head. You can change the words that you choose to use. You can change how you react to things. You can change where you place your trust. You can change those things. It's hard. It takes courage to change those things. But you can change those things. What you cannot change is what other people think or how they feel or what they're going to do or not do. Those are things you cannot change. It takes wisdom to recognize that and to place your trust in a good and gracious God to handle that stuff. To not step out of your lane and start exercising the power to control when what you ought to be doing is exercising the power to create, to come alongside, to help people flourish. You do that, do more of that, you will flourish, and the people that God has given you the privilege to influence and be around, they'll flourish. You make it possible for them to make things possible, and that's a lot of possibility. We're going to finish our service this morning, as we always do, by taking communion together. If you're new to our church and you're sitting in your seat and you're like, okay, I don't exactly know what to do with all of that, but yeah, if I'm being honest, I probably control a lot too much. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to be someone who controls everything. I want to take responsibility for the things that I'm supposed to take responsibility for, and I want to relinquish control of everything else, including everyone else, to a good and gracious God who promises to make all things new. If on some level that's the life you want, then the invitation is to come to the table. That's what it means to be in the church. And I invite you to come be a part of the church. When you take the bread that represents Jesus' broken body and the juice that represents his shed blood, you are remembering the good and gracious God who doesn't control you, doesn't coerce you, doesn't determine your outcomes, but comes alongside you, gifts himself to you in all ways. You're remembering that, but you are also choosing to participate in that way of life in the world. Caiaphas should have known better. You should too. In just a minute, I'll invite you to stand if you're able. I'll dismiss you to come to the table starting in the back rows. Come down our center aisle here. We'll have communion tables on the sides of our stage. I invite you to take a prepackaged communion cup back to your seat using the side aisles, and then just take that during this last song. As you feel led, I'll come up in a minute to close our service. Stand with me if you're able. Let me pray. And then I invite you to come to the table. God, we thank you that you are a God who is perfect in your love and faithfulness. That you give yourself to us all the way to the suffering of your Son on the cross. Help us to be the kinds of people who exercise the power to create, to make possible for other people to make things possible just as you did in creating us. We acknowledge the temptation that we all face to control things we were never meant to control, and we acknowledge that in some way it hurts people, it hurts the world. It is a participation in the crucifixion of your Son, Jesus, and we don't want to do that. Free us from that. As we come forward, use these elements to do a spiritual work in us. Continue to transform us into the kinds of people who live as your true children in this world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Met me at my lowest moment. You saw me at my very worst. When I expected disappointment, love was all I heard. My sin was deep, grace was deeper. My shame was wide, your arms were wider. My guilt was great, love was greater still. You ran to me when I was naked. You clothed me in your righteousness. You pulled me from the depths of darkness into your light again. Oh, into your light why